We're in Santiago, Chile. It's early morning on September 11th, 1973. Around 6 a.m., President Salvador Allende hears news of a revolt and rushes to La Moneda, the presidential palace. The news is jarring. 2 Navy units stationed at Valparaíso have risen in rebellion. They've seized control of 2/3 of the country's cruisers. Allende thinks this is limited to the Navy, just a faction of officers. At La Moneda, he urges the Chilean people to remain calm. Continue working, he says. He asks the armed forces to respect the constitutionally elected government. But by 8 a.m., the army has shut down most radio and television stations in Santiago. Half an hour later, both the military and the carabineros broadcast their first edict. They declare that Allende must surrender his office to them. They've tasked themselves with protecting Chile, quote, from falling beneath the Marxist yoke. Allende still thinks only part of the Navy is conspiring against him. He tries calling his military leaders, Augusto Pinochet, General of the Army, Gustavo Ley, General of the Air Force. They ignore his calls. Admiral Montero, the Navy's commander and an Allende loyalist, has been rendered incommunicado, sabotaged by the coup planners. Only at 8:30 a.m. does Allende understand the magnitude of what's happening. The armed forces control Chile. He's been deposed, but he refuses to resign. And within hours, he'll be dead. So how did Chile, a country with a strong tradition of representative democracy, end up here? With tanks surrounding the presidential palace and fighter jets bombing it from above. Well, it starts with the Cold War, and with the United States deciding it could not let socialism take root in Latin America. By the 1960s, Chile had developed a strong tradition of representative democracy. Transitions of power were peaceful. There were numerous political parties across the ideological spectrum. But the beginning of the Cold War and the establishment of a communist regime in Cuba drew United States attention to Latin America. The US was determined to prevent the spread of leftist movements and Soviet influence in the region. So they began covertly funding presidential campaigns that supported centrist or right-wing, even far-right candidates who opposed socialism and aligned itself with US interests. The US government was particularly concerned with Chile. Why? 2 major US-owned copper companies operated there, and the Chilean left was increasingly talking about nationalizing them. That debate came to a head in the 1964 presidential election. Salvador Allende, running for a 3rd time as a left-wing candidate, faced Christian Democratic candidate Eduardo Frei. Allende wanted to nationalize the copper companies. The CIA intervened. They provided financial support to Frei's campaign, fearing that Allende's victory could result in Chile adopting communism and broadening Soviet influence in South America. They couldn't let him win. Frei won and became president for the next 6 years. But Allende ran again in 1970. Richard Nixon was now US president, and Henry Kissinger his assistant for national security affairs. They saw Allende as a threat to US interests and as a friend of the Soviet Union. According to CIA estimates and former KGB archivists, Allende's campaign received $350,000 from Cuba and more than $400,000 from the Soviet Union. In the lead-up to the 1970 election, the nationalization of copper remained a key issue. The US intensified its covert involvement. The CIA launched an operation called Track 1, a plan to influence the outcome through financial and political support for opposition candidates to Allende. Despite the CIA's efforts, Allende narrowly led the race. The Chilean Congress would have to choose between the two leading candidates. Track 1 had failed, but it didn't deter President Nixon. If you are enjoying my videos so far, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. You can also check out my other video about the Georgian coup by clicking here. Immediately, a new covert plan emerged. Nixon personally ordered the CIA to organize a coup to prevent Allende from taking office. The plan was named Track 2. It was to be executed in October 1970, ahead of Congress's confirmation session to swear in Allende. CIA agents found right-wing Chilean military officers willing to initiate the coup. They supplied them with money and guarantees of US support for the new government. After 2 failed attempts, right-wing extremists in the military tried for a 3rd time to kidnap René Schneider, the commander-in-chief of the Chilean army. Schneider believed that the Chilean military should remain apolitical. The operation failed with disastrous effects. Schneider was fatally shot during the attempted abduction, and the Chilean people rallied around Allende. Even trying to bribe Congress to vote against ratifying Allende's election failed. Congress voted to elect Allende by a wide margin. The US State Department later publicly denied any efforts to block Allende's inauguration. Both the Soviet Union and the United States responded cautiously to Allende's swearing in. Nixon called the US response toward Allende's new government, quote, "cool and very correct," in a meeting days after the inauguration, a stance that would soon prove far from reality. Shortly after Allende's victory, Nixon gave specific instructions to CIA Director Richard Helms, quote, "make the economy scream." American covert activities in Chile would be called Project Fubelt. The aim was to create a coup climate and undermine Allende's administration. Now, it's important to understand that the US wasn't the only reason for what happened next. Chile was politically polarized. Allende took office having won just over a 1/3 of the votes. Congress was deadlocked, the far left was mobilizing, but so was the far right. Allende's efforts to transform Chile into a socialist society while respecting democratic institutions, civil liberties, and the rule of law was initially popular, but it soon created economic instability and polarized the population. Nationalization of various industries soured Chile's relationship with the United States. Workers' wages increased, but hyperinflation and shortages soon followed as Chile was unable to meet the new middle class's growing demand for consumer goods. Nixon's foreign loan blockade toward Chile made the country's economic issues worse. Allende complained to the United Nations in 1972 of, quote, "large-scale external pressure to cut us off from the world, to strangle our economy and paralyze trade, and to deprive us of access to sources of international financing." The US also used its influence in international banks and financial institutions to pressure its allies to do the same. Nixon didn't want to contribute to the success of a socialist government. He claimed Chile could seek funds from the Soviet Union, but they were uninterested in helping and limited funds to a few insufficient credits. Project Fubelt continued at full speed. Inflation started to soar, the CIA funded the most important truckers' union, and the truckers went on strike. There were blockades. That's how the shortages began. Food and basic necessities weren't being delivered. People were waiting in line. Polarization in the country increased. The military increasingly saw that there was no other way out except for a military coup. Between 1971 and 1973, discontentment with Allende's policies led to numerous strikes. The CIA allocated more than $8 million to activities to disrupt his presidency. By 1973, about 250,000 people were participating in anti-Allende actions. The CIA funded opposition media and news outlets, as well as opposition parties. Kissinger maintained that the CIA's involvement was necessary to sustain opposition parties and an independent press against alleged threats from Allende. In May 1973, a coup attempt tried to seize the presidential palace. A military faction fired at the building from their tanks, but this was stopped by the army and its general Carlos Prats. The failed coup undermined Prats's standing within the army. He was perceived as too loyal to Allende and lost the popular support of the army. Augusto Pinochet would succeed him in August 1973. On September 8th, the CIA received reports of an impending coup in 3 days. Nixon was informed and followed the situation closely. The date of September 11th was in fact chosen to match a historical 1924 coup in Chile. By 8 a.m. on September 11th, 1973, 2 Navy units stationed at Valparaíso rose in rebellion and seized control of 2 out of the 3 of the country's cruisers. The Navy strategically stationed ships and marine infantry in the central coast and closed radio and television networks. From there, the revolt spread. Leftist leaders were being arrested. Allende rushed to La Moneda after hearing the news. Allende's defense minister, Orlando Letelier, was arrested by the military when he reached the defense ministry. He would later be assassinated in Washington, D.C. in 1976. Most likely on Pinochet's orders. José Toribio Merino, a coup planner, took leadership of the Navy. Augusto Pinochet and Gustavo Ley continued ignoring Allende's telephone calls. Despite evidence that all branches of the Chilean armed forces were involved in the coup, Allende hoped that some units remained loyal to the government. He was convinced of Pinochet's loyalty, telling a reporter that the coup leaders must have imprisoned the general. Only at 8:30 a.m. did he grasp that the armed forces had declared their control of Chile and that he was deposed. Still, he refused to resign. By 9 a.m., the armed forces controlled Chile, except for the city center of Santiago. Allende had made it to La Moneda before they could arrest him at his residence. They threatened to bomb the building if he resisted being deposed. Threats turned to negotiations. They offered to fly him and his family out of Chile. He refused. He also refused the Communist Party's proposal to escape to southern Santiago, regroup, and lead a counter-coup d'etat. For Allende, change had to happen through non-violent methods. At 9:10 a.m., he gave a farewell speech. He told the nation of the coup d'etat and his refusal to resign his elected office under threat. The military junta responded with an ultimatum, asking for Allende's resignation. It was now clear that no unit of the armed forces had stayed loyal. The carabineros, the national police, blocked the surrounding streets as armored vehicles surrounded La Moneda. The Air Force threatened to bomb the palace. Allende negotiated a truce to allow the civilian staff to evacuate. He organized the palace's defenses with 200 loyal police officers at his command. General Ley ordered the presidential palace bombed, but was told it would take 40 minutes for the jets to arrive from their base. Pinochet ordered an armored and infantry force to advance upon La Moneda, but they were forced to retreat after coming under fire from snipers perched on rooftops. General Arellano called for helicopter gunship support, and the troops were able to advance again. The Air Force soon arrived to provide close air support for the assault, bombing the palace. The bombing began around noon. La Moneda caught on fire. But the defenders didn't surrender until nearly 2:30 p.m. Allende would be found in his inner office dead from a self-inflicted bullet wound. The exact circumstances of Allende's death are still disputed, but it is generally accepted as a suicide. Prior to this, he addressed the nation one more time in what would be his last speech. I have faith in Chile and its destiny. Other men will overcome this dark and bitter moment when treason seeks to prevail. Go forward knowing that sooner rather than later, the great avenues will open again where free men will walk to build a better society. Long live Chile. Long live the people. Long live the workers. These are my last words, and I am certain that my sacrifice will not be in vain. Pinochet's rule officially began at 2:30 p.m. on September 11, 1973. He led a military junta and began a ruthless campaign against communists and socialists. People were tortured and killed in detention centers across Chile. Tens of thousands went into exile, mostly to Europe, but some went to the US and Mexico. Pinochet dismantled Congress and outlawed left-wing political parties. He took control of all the media and turned them into propaganda machines. Roughly 30,000 people were rounded up in Santiago's National Stadium, while improvised detention centers appeared across Chile. Political prisoners were sent to remote concentration camps, and in 1975, Pinochet declared that no future elections would be held in Chile. The US government continued to view Pinochet favorably because of his anti-communist stance and his adoption of free market economic reforms. They ignored the extensive human rights abuses. The US lifted its foreign loan blockade on Chile. In a meeting, Kissinger was quoted, "The president is worried that we might want to send someone to Allende's funeral." I said I didn't believe we were considering that. Only after the assassination of Orlando Letelier in 1976 and the election of Jimmy Carter in 1977 did we see a change in US policy towards Pinochet's regime. Carter's administration implemented sanctions in 1979. By that time, Chile had already become a pariah on the diplomatic world stage, with condemnations from the United Nations. Even Reagan's administration eventually concluded that Pinochet had to go. The full extent of CIA involvement in Chile remains unknown because only a portion of its documents have been declassified. Thanks for watching this video about the 1973 coup in Chile. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing and liking the video. You can also check out my other videos on the channel. I have quite a few now about different historical subjects, so feel free to check them out. And I will see you in my next video.